So I'm Shannon Dottie. I'm a co-director of 3CT. It's the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. And thank you for joining us today for one of our book salons to discuss Neil Brenner's New Urban Spaces, Urban Theory and the Scale Question, which was published last year by Oxford. And let me just say a couple things about the New Book Salon, which was a series or a new format that I started, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago, maybe 7, I'm losing track of time. And the idea was, it was a realization that so many of us publish books. We've worked on them for years. I think 5 years is probably a minimum, although some people are quite prolific. Some books we work on for 20 years. And it's like a little pebble in a pond, little ripples, but you don't really know what the effect is. It's actually, I had talking to people, we had common experiences of it being a little bit of a letdown to have it finally published. And over the years you get reviews and feedback and you understand better how it's received. But at that time, there's not a whole lot. And book launches have increasingly become a thing at conferences, et cetera, but they have kind of a real promotional feel as opposed to a group of friends and scholars who read and talk about it like in an old style salon. I also really like the combination of sociality and a topic for discussion that the salon form enables. So I wanted to bring that to 3CT, and it's been very successful as a celebration of the scholar and their work and sociability. I do encourage you to relax a little bit and have a drink if you like, if that's your thing, water or coffee or anything else. Eat, bring pets in. I think I did see one pet. And enjoy yourselves. What we're going to do is we usually ask I'll introduce Neil in a second, although I imagine for most of you, he doesn't really need an introduction. And then we ask the author to give some background and context for the book, just pretty briefly. It's not a lecture supplanting reading the book. And then the commentator, who's or discussant, who's me in this case, will offer some reflections and some questions to get us started, and then we'll open it to the floor for questions. Logistically on that, a note, because it's such a large group, we did want to make it, both Neil and I, a meeting rather than a webinar, so we can see your faces and feel like it's a little bit more interactional despite the strange times and technologies that we're living. But if you would, what would really help us keep things going in a fair and efficient fashion is if you use the chat function to me in particular, if you can, to just indicate that you have a question. If you have poor connectivity, you can also type your question in there and I will read it out. So without much more to say, let me get into it by introducing Neil. He has just rejoined Chicago with a new status. He started in just autumn of this year, 2020. He has the coolest named chair or named professorship I have ever heard. He is the Lucy Flower Professor of Urban Sociology. And I don't know who Lucy Flower is or was, but fantastic name. And Neil had got his doctorate across the hallway or across the quad in poli-sci at University of Chicago, finishing in 1999. So he's quite familiar with the quad that we would usually be our lived space. He, prior to that, got an MA in geography at UCLA, a fantastic place, the 1990s, to get a geography degree, and a BA in philosophy from Yale, where he met Jeremy Bendick-Keimer, who's also a friend of mine and put us in touch. So there's a personal connection there. And this training just only starts to get at his polymath abilities as a sociologist, geographer, and urban theorist, who's also in conversation he's in conversation with these fields, but also with environmental studies, urban design practice. He comes to us from Harvard School of Design, spatial humanities, and just generally a vibrant interest at 3CT in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. He's, and forgive me, Neil, if I've miscounted, but the author of 3 books, the editor of at least 3 more. Maybe that was the one I might have miscounted because I got lost in translations. His books have been translated into Chinese, Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian, and probably, I suspect, more to come. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Neil, to give us some context for this big book.
Perfect. Shannon, thank you very much for the introduction. And Jeremy Bendick-Kiemer, who is our mutual friend who Shannon mentioned, is in the room. So greetings, Jeremy, one of my oldest friends. And I just want to say before I start, a couple things before I get warmed up. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present this book in 3CT. It was published in 2019. It feels like a lifetime ago, because obviously it's been a tumultuous year, to put it mildly. But I deeply appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. And maybe as we get into the discussion, we can talk about ways in which this framework might potentially contribute something useful in relation to trying to decipher the current crisis. But I also just want to say thanks. There's a lot of people in the room, and I just want to express my deepest gratitude to everyone for coming. Zoomland is a tricky thing. It would obviously be lovely to be in person, but one of the things that's actually amazing about the fact that we're all using this format is that just looking across the screen, I'm really deeply moved. I'm seeing friends from 25 plus years, students from Harvard, colleagues and students from NYU. Bill Sewell, my doctoral thesis advisor, is here. Greetings, Bill. Wonderful that you could make it, and et cetera, and so many others. So I just, thank you to all. And actually, I have a tradition when I do these Zoom, I've done a few Zoom talks in the last year, as have obviously many of you. And I have a tradition, we're all in the habit of just, video off because you're in a giant seminar room rather than a small one. But just before we start up, like in the spirit that Shannon also invoked of let's make it a salon, let's just say hello to each other, even though you probably can't see everyone on the screen. Turn your video on just for a second and give a wave to the colleagues, even though we're not together. And just wish everyone, I wish good health, well-being, sanity, and maybe even a burst of creativity in this difficult time. So even though I see, the checkerboard moving across the screen, I just think it's good to do that. And maybe when I'm done with the presentation, as we open it up, turn on your video. I've actually got 3 screens in front of you. So even as I present my presentation, I'm going to be looking at y'all. So anyway, it's up to you if you want to turn the video off. I'm, no worries, but I'm, for me, desperately seeking some sort of eye contact and communication beyond the world, the kind of privatized world that many of us are living in. So, okay. So I want to basically introduce the book a little bit, and I want to do it in a way, I guess there are a couple big messages before I go into some of the details. And one of the big messages is that this is actually something that I learned from Moishe Postone, who tragically passed away not that long ago, and who's very much on my mind. And he was one of my professors here. And one of the things that Moishe taught, generations of students and colleagues is that theory has to mutate in relation to a changing world. Critical theory is never a fixed doctrine or set of epistemologies or concepts. It's an attempt to critically decipher a changing world in relation to the struggles and contradictions of that world. And for me, that's kind of starting point for critical urban theory. And that's basically what this book is about. It's something I learned from Moishe when I was a doctoral student here 25 years ago. And to some degree, I think that's a proposition that applies in many, many different fields. And it certainly applies in urban theory. We're trying to understand processes of urban transformation, crisis, struggle. And we're trying to develop a framework through which to understand a mutating world. And this book is basically a kind of narrative of my own efforts to do that, offering some modest proposals. And then in a certain way, about 2/3 of the way through the book, a kind of Aufhebung, a supersession of the framework, and offering some new proposals, which hopefully we will also supersede in relation to a changing world, maybe a more emancipatory one, we can only hope. And the other thing that I would say just by way of introduction is that there's a lot of maneuvers that I'm going to talk about as concisely as I can, and which I think we'll get into a little bit in dialogue with Shannon shortly, which are very specific to the problems of urban studies and questions about the urban and the city and urbanization. But some of the conceptual grammar that I offer related to scale and maybe related to other aspects of sociospatial dynamics, perhaps they might have relevance to other fields of study. A big agenda in this book is to critique certain naturalized assumptions about the object of analysis in the field of urban studies, especially the idea that urban studies should study cities, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but we have to unpack what do we mean by cities. So that maneuver of kind of critically interrogating naturalized objects of analysis, that's something that we do in many different fields of investigation, whether it's nationalism studies or the study of the economy or the study of culture. I mean, lots of people in this room are deeply familiar with and engaged in debates in those terrains. So maybe even if you may not be that concerned about the particular problems and dead ends of the field of urban studies, maybe there might be some epistemological maneuvers and conceptual maneuvers at work in this discussion that might resonate in relation to other fields. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to try to, can y'all see my screen? Maybe give me a thumbs up if it's okay. Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you. So I'm going to talk for about maybe 10 minutes, 15 at the most. Shannon asked me to keep it brief, so I keep an eye on the clock and just try to give you a sense of the book. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to do, it's a pretty densely written book. I know that Shannon has been reading it. I'm not sure if others have. It's pretty densely written, but I'm going to do a bit of just read a couple passages just to give you a taste of the narrative and the language and just some of the maneuvers that I'm making. So definitely not a poetry reading, but I feel like I should read something from the book just to give you a taste. And it could be that when I read a passage, you'll be convinced you don't want to go anywhere near the book, but maybe the passages I'll read, at least for some of you, you might think, okay, I'll give it a read. So, okay, so basically the problematique, as I've already said, the big question around the book, which the book is framed, is how do we understand the urban and urbanization in a time of dramatic crisis, mutation and contestation at all scales around the world? The urban is changing, how do we understand it? And my argument, my kind of meta argument is that in order to confront this challenge, like clearly we need to do deep, systematic, contextually embedded research in different places, comparatively framed, historically informed. But my concern for many years now has been to interrogate the inherited conceptualizations of the phenomena under investigation. So in other words, we're not going to really be well oriented in relation to the mutations of urban life today unless we also critically interrogate the frameworks, the epistemologies, the concepts, and even the methods as well through which we engage with these phenomena. So the book has a couple layers. It's a critical interrogation of several inherited framings of the urban question, both mainstream, Chicago school, as it were, as well as the Marxian tradition and the LA school of urban geography, among others, which I'm very much formed by. I'm also critically interrogating some of the methodological foundations that I built on in my earlier work. And then I offer some proposals and strategies for a radical couple of series of reconceptualizations of urban processes, and indeed of the field of urban studies itself. In a way, the book is as much about contemporary, by which I mean post-1970s, post-1980s, processes of urban restructuring as it is about urban studies. Like, what is the field of urban studies? Should the field exist? And if so, what's its basis for existence? What's its core problematique? So for me, theory is just a precondition and an outcome of all research in any field, and certainly in the field of urban studies. And my conception of theory, I spend a bit of time in the book trying to explicate my particular conception of theory, which again, Moishe Postone looms large here as a really formative mentor for me. The emphasis on reflexivity, that a critical theory has to account for its own possibility as critical, within a particular social context. And it also has to be open to the possibility of its own mutation in relation to the forward motion and contradictions of the social formation it aspires to understand. A key agenda of critical theory for me, which has been really central to my work in urban studies over the years and is really essential to this book as well, is the critique of urban ideologies. When I was in grad school in the 90s, urban studies was an interesting field and a lively field, but it was kind of a subfield within the social sciences. We were talking about globalization, and urban studies was part of it. But these days, when I look around, the field of urban studies, the inquiry into the urban, it's exploding in relation to debates on the Anthropocene, debates on so many aspects of contemporary society. It's really become a pretty fundamental central stream of social science, but there's a lot of obfuscation and distortion. There's a lot of discursive framings of the urban that I would argue basically serve to reproduce dominant forms of power, oppression, exclusion, and ecological destruction. So for this reason, the critique of urban ideology for me is not just an academic exercise, it's an issue which directly connects up to fields of practice, because urban knowledge, including urban social science knowledge, directly influences the paradigms that we use in planning and design and architecture and in urban policy. So critique of urban ideology is really important for me. The labor of reconceptualization, the dialectical spiral, what I mean by this is simply that to develop and elaborate and fine-tune any conceptual framework and any critique of urban ideology, you always have to engage with concrete sites of research. So the dialectical spiral, that's of course a characterization or a concept from Marx and the Grundrisse. It's a way of reading some of Marx's arguments on method in the Grundrisse. It means that abstract concepts always have to be, in a certain way, collided with concrete conditions, which then enables one to reinvent those abstractions in relation to a changing world. So there's a certain kind of dialectical spiral that I'm trying to perform in this book. And that in turn, the hope, the aspiration within this particular understanding of critical theory and method is that such an endeavor, such a pursuit of a reflexive, critical approach will then open up new avenues for thinking, for concrete research, and also perhaps for action. In other words, a key horizon for me of critical urban theory is to explore the prospect of what I've elsewhere called, and what I call in the book, alter urbanizations, the idea of building, constructing collectively alternative forms of urbanization to the ones that currently prevail. So that's also a kind of horizon of the book, even though I don't elaborate it in much concrete detail here. The idea is that the point of the critique is to open up space for emancipation, both in the realm of imagination and discourse, as well as in the realm of material practice and institutional arrangements. So a bit about the genesis of the book. I could go on in detail about it, and I won't, but I do need to say something about how the book emerged, because it's a book that effectively, I didn't know it at the time, but effectively I've been writing the book and thinking about the book for about 20 years. I think if I'd known it was going to take me 20 years to write it, I might not have done it, but that's how things work. So I did my PhD, as Shannon mentioned, here in the 90s. I was really interested in urban governance. I then studied at UCLA with some members of the LA school of, basically it's a school of agglomeration theory, among other things, which I'm very critical of in this book. When I taught at NYU in the 2000s, I was focused on urban governance restructuring, collaborating with Nick Theodore, who I think is also in the room tonight. Greetings, Nick, on neoliberalization processes. And then for the last decade, I've been at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I was engaging with planners, designers, architects, as well as my wonderful doctoral students at Harvard, several of whom are also in the room. Greetings to y'all. And developing some ideas around planetary urbanization, which are also very central to this particular book. So I wrote a book, I published it in 2004, called New State Spaces, and this is a certain kind of companion to that book. And let me just explain how those two books articulate. New State Spaces was loosely derived from the doctoral thesis that I defended here in 1999. So New State Spaces was a study of urban governance. And the explanandum there was actually the remaking of state space. So I was dealing with urbanization and urban restructuring, but my goal was actually not directly to critically interrogate the urban. I was really interested in how the state and state spatial configurations in Europe were being transformed in the context of basically 50 years of political, economic, and spatial transformation. So effectively, the object of analysis was state space or statehood, and the lens, the method was to study urban governance, the state's strategies to regulate urbanization. In new urban spaces, effectively, I'm still dealing with all of those dynamics and processes, and indeed some of the same historical geographical transformations, but the analytic lens has shifted. Here, the focus, the central focus is not the state, but rather the urban and urbanization processes. But just as in new state spaces, I'm very interested in the ways in which urbanization processes are mediated and produced through state spatial strategies. So effectively, the same set of elements are in play in this book, but the explanandum, the kind of real focus of analysis, is now urbanization, not only in Europe, but in a variety of different global regions and ultimately on a planetary scale. But here too, I am very concerned with the ways in which the urban is produced and mediated through spatialized structures and strategies of state power. So that's a key argument in this book. So in some ways, the foundations for the book, I had to share this with you because this this article, Fixity in Motion, I wrote that paper basically in the mid-90s, much of which sitting in Wilder House, which is kind of an ancestral home, we might say, of 3CT. I think it's broadly connected. And I wrote that paper. I was reading Henri Lefebvre, and I think Dipesh Chakrabarti is in the room, so I have to acknowledge Dipesh because it was with Dipesh and Manu Goswami, and also Bill Sewell, that I first read Henri Lefebvre very deeply. And this paper was, in a certain way, a first product of that exploration, which I didn't know it at the time, but it continued for decades, and it will probably continue to this day. But chapter 2 of New Urban Spaces is a radically rewritten and updated version of that Fixity Motion article that I basically published in 1998. And I just have to share with you, like, there are a lot of people in the room who are certainly much younger than me, but I just want to draw your attention as a, hopefully, this is not nostalgia, but this is just technological change. You'll note that my email address is nbrenner@compuserve.com. So this was in the days when like most of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but some of the older participants in the group will know. Back in the day, not that long ago for me, but for some of you, this is like ancient history. The university didn't really have a server and didn't give us an email. So I was kind of an early mover. I had my own email address. So some of you are nodding, so you might remember CompuServe. But anyway, I won't go any further on that. But that was the beginning of sort of establishing some of the methodological foundations for this project. I'm aware that I've already gone on for a little bit too long, so I'm just going to skip a bunch of stuff. And so the book is framed with around a bunch of critical dialogues with different traditions of urban theory. Agglomeration theory, there's kind of a scalar reading of agglomeration theory. There's a reading of global city theory, the work of Saskia Sassen and others, debates on the new economy, so-called debates on the new regionalism, debates on growth machine theory. And then towards the end of the book, debates on planetary and extended urbanization. And the core argument, I'll just kind of summarize. So again, the key puzzle is how to understand the mutations of urban life during the last 50 years. I'm synthesizing different studies that advance interlinked epistemological and conceptual strategies to try to confront this challenge. And the core, at least one core stream of the book, is to mobilize a scalar lens to explore these mutations of the urban as a rescaling of the capitalist urban fabric. And let me just quickly explain what I mean by that. I'm sure that we're going to get into it in dialogue with Shannon. But basically, that in a nutshell, what I mean by that is this. In most inherited approaches to the urban, or to the urban understood as the city is contrasted to the suburb and maybe the rural or the hinterland or the wilderness. So it's kind of a horizontal territorial mapping where you think of the city as a settlement type, and it's kind of transforming through its morphology or maybe through its size, but it's embedded within a kind of almost like a transverse, like in the famous, the famous Getty's transverse. It's kind of like a transverse with all these different settlement types on the transverse. And basically what I'm trying to explore in the bulk of this book is the idea that maybe urban restructuring is not simply the restructuring of those settlement types understood as fixed containers of particular kinds of social relations, which in a certain way is the argument that the Chicago School famously developed and systematized. What if urban restructuring is actually scalar, by which I mean, so for me, scale is kind of a hierarchical or vertical structuration of space, the reorganization of the relations between, and then specifying the terms as a puzzle, but let's just use for the moment, local or urban, regional or metropolitan, national, supranational, global. Each of those terms I intend not as a transhistorical indicator, but as historically specific references to relationally interconnected dynamics, whether of state power, of urbanization, it could be of economic life. So any number of important macro socio-spatial processes are scale differentiated. Economic development or capital accumulation, state regulation, urbanization for starters. And so the proposition here is that what would it look like to think about urban restructuring during the last 50 years as a remaking of scales, by which I mean the interscalar hierarchy within which cities or urban regions are embedded. And that's basically what I explore. So it's not just this horizontal axis, but this vertical axis, and what kinds of horizons for understanding the mutations of urbanization post-1970s does that open up. And then at the end of the book, basically the last couple of chapters, as I already briefly alluded to earlier, it's a certain kind of autocritical reformulation, or to use Hegel's famous term, a certain kind of Aufhebung, like a supersession or transcendence. I mean, I think as most people here will know, in Hegel and in Hegelian Marxism, it doesn't just mean you're overcoming that which preceded it, but that you're preserving it, but also transforming that which preceded it. So that's relevant here because the Aufhebung that I attempt as I elaborate some ideas about extended and planetary urbanization, it totally contains some of the scalar conceptualizations that I develop further in the book, but it then embeds them within a framework that's not only scalar, but articulates to a variety of other considerations. So let me just show you, I'm gonna stop my presentation shortly because I definitely want to hear from Shannon and we want to get into a broader discussion, but let me just share with you the table of contents. So basically the first couple of chapters, basically chapters 1, 2, and 3, and you can see the fixity in motion chapter, the one I mentioned earlier from back in my grad school days that's now reworked and reinvented. That's kind of the theoretical foundation of the book in terms of what would it mean to think about the urban question as a scale question. What do I mean by scale? How are the scalar dimensions of urbanization articulated to some of the underlying dynamics, contradictions, and crisis tendencies of capitalist urbanization, building heavily on Henri Lefebvre, but also David Harvey. And then the next 4 chapters, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, effectively critically engage with a variety of different traditions of urban theory on questions about globalization, economic restructuring, regionalism, and urban governance, and develop scale-attuned readings. So I'm effectively layering this scalar analytic into some established literatures, both as a kind of critical engagement with them, but also as a way to open up some thinking about concrete patterns and pathways of urban restructuring since the 1970s. And then chapter 8 is a kind of bridge chapter. I don't know if I can compare it to like a jazz composition. It's definitely very different from jazz, but like in a musical composition where there's a bridge section between 2 parts of the composition, in the sense that there I critically interrogate it's a kind of auto critique of a scalar lens, suggesting that scale is part of the story of urbanization and uneven geographic development, but there are many other dimensions of the spatiality of the urban and of urbanization, including placemaking, territorialization, networking, and the remaking of environment, which are also mutating in very powerful ways. So even though it's productive to put the scalar analytic in the foreground such that we can try to decipher some of these patterns and pathways, it's actually one-sided, and one doesn't want to, I criticize city centrism and many other centrisms in the book, but one doesn't want to replace those centrisms, as it were, with a scale centrism, or the fetishism of the city with a fetishism of scale. So I'm trying to avoid that. And this then opens into the final couple of chapters on planetary urbanization, which I think Shannon is going to open up some questions about, so I won't try to summarize here. But it's just to say that that adds yet another layer of kind of analytic and epistemological experimentation to this particular study. So basically, the diagram on the right is from the introduction, but it's just basically the structure of the book. Those first 3 chapters, the methodological framework, the kind of critical elaborations, and then the autocritique and theoretical renovation, the kind of Aufhebung. So I think I probably should stop, but if I may, could I just read, let me just choose a couple excerpts to read from, just to give you a little flavor. There's obviously a lot more to be said about what I tried to do in the book, but hopefully my overview has at least given you a sense of just what the stakes are for me, what some of the theoretical commitments are, and what I'm up to. But let me just choose, let me choose this one. I'm just gonna choose two passages to read. So there's a lot of discussion in the book about how does the city fit into the broader problematique of urbanization? I think the city matters, but it's only part of the story. So here's what I say. The city, I argue, is only one element within an expression of the multiscalar, polymorphic, and restlessly mutating geographies of capitalist urbanization. These are constituted through the relentless implosion of sociospatial processes into dense centers of population, infrastructure, and economic activity, and through the equally dynamic explosion of sociospatial relations across vast territories, landscapes, and ecologies that are likewise being perpetually enclosed, operationalized, industrialized, and creatively destroyed in support of capital's voracious profit-driven metabolism, whether for purposes of industrialized agriculture, extraction, energy generation, logistics, waste processing, environmental management, or otherwise. In a way, this passage goes to the heart of the problematique of planetary urbanization. David Harvey and others famously focus on the creative destruction of urban space, understood as the dynamic reconfiguration of cities and metropolitan regions in conjunction with capital's dynamics of overaccumulation. And what I've been suggesting with many colleagues and collaborators in recent years is that that dynamic of creative destruction that's so powerfully crystallized within large metropolitan regions is also occurring through their articulations to non-city spaces of agriculture, of extraction, of logistics, of ecological devastation, which are directly intermeshed with the urbanization process. We can't understand city building processes today except in relation to industrial agriculture, fossil fuel energetics, and all the logistics and extractive infrastructure connected to it, and all the externalized metabolic waste associated with those processes. Those processes are not spatialized as cities, but I want to argue, building upon Lefebvre and building upon other work in this tradition, are absolutely part of the urban fabric, and any critical urban theory today that really merits that name has to systematically deal with them. So let me just conclude with this passage, and Shannon, I promise I'll stop with this. Thank you all for so patiently listening. So this in some ways is the meta-theoretical argument which applies to both moments of the book's argument, the scalar analytic and the planetary urbanization analytic. So I'll just read this passage and then I'll stop. So it's basically, what do we mean, given all these arguments, by urban restructuring? So here's my attempt to clarify that. To speak of urban restructuring, therefore, is not to reference a process of transformation that is occurring within familiar, stable, ahistorical, or trans-historical units of analysis, cities, city regions, metropolitan regions, or otherwise. Rather, within the framework proposed here, it is the urban itself that is being reconstituted in and through the spatiotemporal dynamics of urban restructuring. It is, in other words, the very nature of urban spaces, their very coherence, operationality, and intelligibility as such, and their corresponding relationships to other equally dynamic scales of political economic activity that is transformed through restructuring processes. In this sense, the constitutive properties, elements, and parameters of urban spaces are never pre-given, but are continually made and remade through the broader multi-scalar sociospatial transformations that animate and continually disrupt the dynamics of capitalist development. So urban restructuring is not just pointing to, oh, we're referring to urban restructuring in those places that we call urban. That which is being restructured is the urban itself. So it points to a problem that we have to then unpack, as Maurice Postone would say, and interrogate rather than something we already understand, which we then simply need to describe. Okay, I think I should stop there. Thank you all very much for your patience and attention, and I look forward to our conversation. Shannon.
All right, thank you so much, Neil. That was very helpful to me too, because it's such a big and rich book. I have to say it was, I had more than one takeaway, and I really had to pare down my comments because I also want to leave room for questions. And I felt like after I finished reading it that I'd had the benefit of about 3 graduate seminars in urban studies that caught me up on the last 40 years of what's been going on. I'd say the last 20 years, because my education in urban studies is a little dated, but that especially helped for the last 20 years of a very heterogeneous, what's always been a heterogeneous field, but you really helped me understand just how wildly overgrown it has become in some ways as it gets more and more entangled with practice and practitioners as well. So my comments, I think, are going to be of a nature of like a complementarity with the E, in that I'm a very different kind of urban thinker. And what appeals to me about Lefebvre is a different Lefebvre than what you latched onto. So I'm hoping that there'll be kind of productive difference that'll stimulate a conversation between us, but also maybe going in a direction that will help those in the audience come up with their own. So a few days before reading your book, I had this thought to myself as I took a lonely early morning dog walk in my neighborhood. And I thought to myself, I wrote this down in my journal, at least the journal in my head, which is, no one in Chicago is living in a city right now. And I think that perhaps, Neil, you'd agree with this, but for different reasons. My reason is that one way to define a city is as a state of mind, an expectation of noise, movement, random encounters with strangers, and the speed of time that Georges Simmel wrote about, as well as the more enjoyable experiences of social dining. We only had dining reopen a few days ago here. Of entertainment, people watching, and of course, fashion. I hope somebody is doing some doctoral dissertation on COVID fashion. There was little to distinguish the social experience of my COVID era walk around my neighborhood in Chicago from a walk in an auto-centric suburb where you rarely see people in the streets. And if you do, you probably don't know their names. And I could be projecting the suburban experience since I've never actually lived in much of one myself, but it's certainly the feeling I get often from visiting suburbs. And as I said, I'm a very different thinker. I have a savage mind that has to think in allegorical and often visual terms. And so as I grappled with what you meant by scale, I kept coming back to something, trying to see it as a fast changing ecosystem, but one often subject to invasive species. I saw something like soil erosion. I saw cycles of wildfires that bring both destruction, but also possibilities of new growth, but sometimes the growth of a whole new species or species community. But the terms you more often use, sometimes you do use, metabolic is a word that comes up a lot. But more often you use terms around cognates of crystals, pulsation, matrix, and most frequently a kind of living urban fabric that gets woven, unraveled, and rewoven by invisible hands. And this quote from your introductory chapter, so I'm glad you didn't pick this one because I have mine that I'm going to share, is an example. You say that the chapters of this is from page 16, you say that the chapters of the book offer, quote, a reconceptualization of capitalist urbanization as a process that includes the moments of city building and city unbuilding, as well as the production and ongoing transformation of a multiscalar, territorially variegated urban fabric, an unevenly extended matrix of sociospatial relations, territorial configurations, infrastructural relays, and metabolic circuits that support or result from capitalist industrialization, end quote. Sorry, I didn't screen share that one. But what strikes me about your language is how electronic it is. Matrix, relays, circuits. And so question number one, is that deliberate? As opposed to an intensified human ecology, which of course is one of the related fields or one of the ones that you are in conversation with. It seems to suggest not only a kind of impersonal machine, which is perhaps the inexorable machine that is capitalism as it comes across here, but a kind of anthropogenic feral technology was the other kind of allegory I came away with. And this brings up two questions for me, which are of a kind that I often have for classic Marxist accounts, as sympathetic as I am to them, which is where lies the human agency in your theory and in your approach? And how do you account for contingency? This is the historian in me asking. How do you account for contingency in the generation of urban forms? The COVID example and what is doing to what Lefebvre called the live city in translation is one example. Though I expect it's also doing unanticipated things to distribution infrastructure, for example, through Amazon's network of trucks, warehouses, routes, drivers, and goods, and their structuring of both microeconomic and macroeconomic realities. Capitalism did not predict COVID. Perhaps it's shaping how it's shaping our world, but it didn't predict it, right? And here might be, or even perhaps wanted, I think, unless we go conspiracy theory route. And so I'm offering here an opening to talk about your current work on the pandemic city, which I'm intensely curious about. And I myself have been thinking about pandemic time, and as I think we both recognize in our work, but in very different ways, space and time are entirely conjoined, and thinking with one without the other just leads to fallacies and a kind of vulgar simplification. So I couldn't think scale with you unless I thought about movement through time. And so the problem with the analytical unit of the city, besides just being an arbitrary heuristic, you know, is it 2000? We have the same problem in archaeology, one of my subdisciplines, of like, is it 2000? I mean, the threshold's really low in archaeology. 2,000 people is a city in the Neolithic. Or is it, you know, qualities, et cetera. But the problem is when you define a city statically, as you said, horizontally, but also just as a bounded unit, you can't appreciate its movement through time, whether we're talking developmentally or just the pulsating life of a city. So my hunger for allegorical hooks and my predilection for the concrete also leads me to invite you to use the example of Chicago to explain what shifting from a city-centric focus to a scalar approach does. And to the question of experience, if you agree that one dimension of the sociospatial lies in the minds of individuals, does this experiential, the live space, the phenomenological, does this exist in other scales that you see, even the largest, the one that you end the book with, planetary urbanization? Is this something that can be internalized, or is this an entirely external analytic? In terms of planetary urbanization, I'd love to hear a little more about where you're going in these new directions, where the book ends, but you're looking outward. And I know from things you've said to me, this is exactly what you're working on now. And there's a way in which the pandemic has made planetary urbanization and global integration more visible, right? Through its own vulnerability. Tracking the virus is kind of like injecting a dye into the bloodstream for a CT scan. It revealed a vast, complex circulatory system. At the same time, with borders shut down and imports slowed, what we once called globalization also seems to have taken several hits and forced some regression and redesign, not to mention nationalism and certain trade policy, shall we say. So contingency here is at also at a very vast scale. Finally, it seems to me that at the same time that you're critical of a kind of naive environmentalism, or perhaps, I don't know if you'd call it a greenwashing in urban planning, and as much as you identify industrial capitalism as being the master engineer of contemporary urban fabrics, you also don't sound hopeless about human potentials for self-correction, if not utopian realizations. So I'd like to hear what possibilities you see for urban futures that address sustainability, social equity, or any other good that is high on your list. I realize that was a lot, so you can pick and choose. Go for it.
Shannon, thank you so much. Incredibly intellectually generous reading of my work, and obviously very provocative questions. Before I dive into trying to respond, let me just ask, shall I try to respond, or do you think we should just open up? Because I've taken careful notes on your remarks, and I'm not going to forget them. And I'm comfortable with, like, if you and others prefer, we could open up and just collect some responses. If people would like me to offer a brief response, that would be a compromise solution rather than going on for 20 more minutes or whatever. But obviously we're grateful that everyone is here, and we would love to, I think I speak for both of us, that Shannon and I, as kind of, you know, the presenters so far, we would love to have other voices in the conversation. So how should we proceed?
What if you, I like to compromise. Usually that's how we go, how we do it. So maybe if just whatever you felt most animated by of what I threw at you, respond to that within just a quick sketch, and then we'll open it up.
Perfect. Great. Yeah, let me just, in a certain way, I'm going to go in reverse. Like, these are really provocative questions. Like, in some ways, it's a very gloomy book, because the processes of urban restructuring of the last 40 or 50 years, both in the global north and in the global south, I think they really had devastating impacts on society and on, you know, sort of the earth system, you know, ecological conditions. Like, there's just been an immense, it's of course celebrated in triumphalist discourses as opening up possibilities for human well-being, but those possibilities for human well-being are so unevenly distributed on a world scale, and with such devastating consequences for, you know, the kind of environmental conditions of the planet, that the cost is very high for those kind of pockets of well-being and security. So it's a grim book. And my hope in general with critical theory, and it's not just my hope, is that we would like to create a world in which such theories are rendered obsolete, because, you know, if we had a more emancipatory, just, ecologically sane world, then maybe we would need other kinds of theories. But for the moment, we need critical theories, given, you know, the kind of brutality and injustice that we're seeing proliferating around us. But in terms of, Shannon, your remark and your observation that there are moments of hope perhaps in the book, I would say yes. And again, it's a lesson I learned from, among other people, Moishe Postone, who's really very much on my mind these days, both because I now live in the neighborhood, but also just because his work is so resonant, you know, in so many ways. I mean, the idea that capitalism is contradictory, and those contradictions, one of the core contradictions for Postone was that capitalism basically opens up possibilities, which it then, the realization of which it suppresses. And I think that's absolutely true in the realm of urbanization. Urbanization involves profound interdependencies between places and territories and ecologies all over the world. It's a web of dense, thickening interdependence. The production of space through urbanization is basically the spatial precondition for those interdependencies. And in a capitalist context, those interdependencies are interwoven and engendered on, through the private pursuit and reinvestment of surpluses. And the dynamism of the system is related to the continual profit-driven reinvestment of the surplus, which again constantly socializes production, but also creates incredible socio-spatial interdependencies. I mean, that's the spatial division of labor, not just the division of labor, Adam Smith style, but the spatial division of labor. And so in a certain way, I mean, Postone makes this point, David Harvey makes this point, Henri Lefebvre makes this point, the social interdependency already exists all around us. In other words, it's not something that we simply have to imagine in terms of some future utopian vision of communism. It's already literally the precondition of our everyday lives. Those interdependencies are obviously premised upon deep exploitation, both of paid and unpaid reproductive work. So it's premised upon a kind of whole matrix of multi-layered exploitation and expropriation. But nonetheless, the interdependencies create at least the possibility of the social channeling of the surplus to support social well-being, social justice, ecological, I don't want to say sustainability because that word's been kind of colonized by neoliberal discourse, but let's just say ecological regeneration, ecological sanity. So to some degree, struggles over urbanization crystallize that contradiction. And that occurs at all scales within the city, but also ultimately within larger territories and on a broader planetary scale. So I want to say something about COVID. Shannon, your remark about COVID and capitalism and urbanization. And I also would like to reflect perhaps later, maybe I'll just for now register. I really appreciate your close reading of my metaphors and the use of these electrical circuitry-like, machine-like metaphors. I think that's a very astute observation. I never thought about it that way before. I think you're right. And I think it's interesting to imagine or to kind of critically interrogate what are the implications and trade-offs of that. In general, I'm looking for metaphors. And I think I have a lot of work to do, even though I've been doing this for a while. I have a lot of work to do with my writing and my language to try to develop an appropriate language for capturing the dynamism, the contradiction, and the open emergent properties of urbanization processes. So Henri Lefebvre would sometimes use these kinds of mechanical electric metaphors like implosion, explosion, which was from the quote I read. That of course comes from Henri Lefebvre. And it's a very important conceptual dyad in my work. I edited a book on planetary urbanization called Implosions, Explosions Towards the Study of Planetary Urbanization. That's not the whole story, but it's certainly a relational dialectical approach to the processes in question, in contrast to the focus on the city, like the famous Chicago school book, The City, or the LA school book that Alan Scott and Edward Soja published, in the 90s. The City, which was LA instead of Chicago, is still basically focused on the agglomeration. And I'm interested in that moment. I'm interested in the agglomeration, but as a moment of broader processes of sociospatial transformation, which are contradictory and crisis-riven. So the search for an adequate language to capture emergence, contradiction, and crisis is just an ongoing problem in the field. And I think we have to be reflexive about it. And your comment certainly encourages us to do that, and really adventurous. In recent years, particularly through my collaborations at Harvard, I've been working a lot with colleagues, including my wonderful PhD students, who are really doing fantastic work with critical cartography and using visual media as a way to explore some of these processes. And that's been incredibly generative for me, not only as it were to try to illustrate, for example, a process like implosion, explosion, but it goes the other way around as well. In other words, by developing a kind of speculative visualization of certain dynamics of urban restructuring, it actually can lead us to then develop a new conceptualization. So visualization can actually be a tool through which to develop and test out theorization. It's not just about developing a theorization and then visualizing it. And I'll just say as a side comment, we're setting up the Urban Theory Lab Chicago. We're in the process of sort of laying its foundations. And what I just said about this interplay between the visual and the theoretical and kind of critical analysis of emergent urbanization processes, that in a certain way is the core agenda of the lab. Shannon, I think I better stop there. Let's bookmark the question about COVID and urbanization. Maybe if anyone is interested in going further in that, I'd love to speak to that. Swarnab Ghosh is in the room. He's a collaborator, PhD student from Harvard GSD, and he and I are working on this, and we have a lot to say about it. It's something we're thinking about. And I'm sure there are other questions that people might also want to raise. So
Right.
Thank you very much.
That's great timing. We still have a whole half hour for open questions. So the way we're hoping this would work is that you indicate in the chat to me, preferably to Shannon Dottie, that you have a question. And then I'll call on you if you would rather type or need to type your question full on into the chat. That's okay too. Let me know. Do you have a question? Barbara Carr was asking while you were talking, what surplus? I think you were, Barbara, would you like to clarify your question? It was coming quickly. Here, she writes, how do we have growth without displacement, create generational wealth with existing public?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that, but I'll just speak to the spirit of the question, which is, the capitalist growth, capital accumulation, it's obviously, I think as folks in this room are familiar with, it's a process of exploitation and surplus value extraction, but it also involves displacement and dispossession. And one of the arguments of the book, which is really important, particularly in the latter couple of chapters on planetary urbanization, is that we have to juxtapose the forms of expropriation and dispossession of people within large metropolitan areas, let's say, for example, through gentrification. We have to juxtapose those processes to the long durée processes of what's often referred in agrarian studies to as depeasantization. In other words, the ways in which the enclosure of land in non-city spaces expropriates agrarian producers from established forms of social reproduction, and often leads to displacement, including circular migration to large metropolitan areas. And much of what within the field of urban studies is framed as the problem, because it's often framed as a problem of informal settlement and slums, is directly connected to fundamental structural transformations of property, land, and investment in the erstwhile countryside. And the planetary urbanization framework, it doesn't have the answer to how to analyze this relationship, but it posits that there's a direct historical and structural relationship between the dispossession, the kind of political economy of agrarian dispossession in the erstwhile countryside, and urbanization processes, including the formation of so-called megacities in the global south from the colonial period all the way up to the present. We need an analytic lens that treats those processes as intrinsically connected. And just to concretize it a little bit, if you think about the famous Chicago School, the Burgess dartboard, that hangs proudly on the wall of our sociology department. So that dartboard, it's not a static depiction. The concentric rings are basically rings of population movement outward from the center into the suburban area. It presupposes continuous immigration into Chicago. And we must pose the question, where do they come from? And why are they coming to the city? So that if you open up your analytic frame in that particular way, whether in relation to Chicago or any other city, you're then including processes of agrarian restructuring, which are of course geopolitically mediated and deeply racialized, within the analysis of what traditionally is understood as urbanization as city building. And to give one other example, just that's a kind of critique of the Chicago School, but let's actually connect it to Engels and his classic analysis of 19th century Manchester. So the condition of the working class in England, for him, crystallizes in the analysis of deep class polarization in the spaces of Manchester and London. And that's, of course, canonical and foundational. I teach it, I build upon it, as do many of my colleagues. But on some level, it's completely impossible to understand what Engels is describing in that classic book unless you connect it up with plantation economies, slavery in the world system in the same moment, and going back obviously earlier than that, because the manufacturing industries that Engels is discussing are basically processing raw materials that are generated through slave labor. So you need an analytic frame. And again, this is not my original argument. Lots of other scholars have made that point, but I'm suggesting that it's not well recognized in the field of urban studies because we tend to draw circles around our objects of analysis and fetishize the city. And the book is basically an attempt to explore various ways of exploding that fetishism of the city. It doesn't mean we don't look at the city or that cities don't exist, which is how some of this work has been misread, unfortunately. It's rather, we need a relational dialectical framework through which to embed cities and metropolitan regions, whatever we call them, within these broader dynamics that are constitutive of urbanization. In other words, slave labor and plantation economies are not extrinsic to 19th century Manchester and its urbanization process, any more than immigration processes, whatever particular aspect of them we're emphasizing, any more than those immigration processes are extrinsic to the neighborhood ecologies that Chicago School urban sociologists were tracking in the 1920s and 30s. It's a pretty elementary point, but it's not, and it may be obvious to lots of folks in the room who might not work in this field. It's like, what, how could you think otherwise? But in fact, if you look at the field of urban studies in terms of the main disciplinary canons, including Marxism, at least certain streams of urban Marxism, not all, certainly agglomeration theory, it's doing a different variation of that, fetishizing the moment of agglomeration and bracketing the broader relational dialectical, multi-scalar geographies that constitutively underpin the production and building and unbuilding of the agglomeration.
We have two questions in the wings. Brandon, would you like to speak yours?
Great, thank you, both to Shannon and to Neil. That was a fantastic lecture and discussion to attend, and I appreciate being able to be here. I wanted to ask you a question to revisit Shannon's question about the simultaneous analysis of both a spatial and temporal scale. And you mentioned about the core argument in your book of the systematic mobilization of a scalar lens to explore mutations as rescaling of capitalist urban fabric. And in your previous answer to the first question, you mentioned a lot about the longue durée issues of slavery and its implications on urbanization processes now, as well as colonialism and informal settlements. I wonder if there's how you see the engagement between the temporal and spatial scale generally, and if you also see the notion of multiple temporal scales also acting simultaneously on your spatial scalar analytic. Thank you.
That's an easy one. Thank you, Brandon. Shannon, shall I try to respond to Comrade Brandon? And he is a comrade. Good to see you, Brandon. Or shall we take the other question?
Are you wiggling out of the question?
No, I always do this. Some of you who know me, I always do this. No, but it's also, I'm just trying to be respectful of getting lots of folks into the conversation. Okay, I'm happy to give it a go.
Diego also had a question, sure.
Oh, good. Diego, greetings. Good to see you.
Hey, Neil. Good to see you. Neil, this is a question that I wrote in other scenarios before. Is a famous paper, pretty famous paper, The Nature of the Cities, right, for Stopper and Alan Scott. This is a good debate about what is city, that we need universally urban theory. And on the other hand, in Latin America, we have other scholar, other research saying, okay, we need our own framework, our own theory, building from Latin America, building from Mexico, from Colombia, from Brazil. And what are your thoughts about this? Because it's a tension, because Stopper and Allen, they say, okay, we need to take the same framework to analyze the different logic of the urbanization process. But also we in the South, not the South, but in Latin America, we are trying to build our own theory. Yeah, this is my question. I know that you are aware of this discussion?
Yeah. Thank you, Diego. Great question. So maybe I'll start with Brandon, and then I'll come to Diego's point. So in terms of spatiotemporal dynamics and how to think about them, and also how to, let me also just connect that question to some practical matters related to how do we do research with all these, for some, I know there are a lot of students in the room, so you may be thinking like, this is super meta-theoretical, abstract, like how does it actually connect to my research? So Brandon's question is also an opportunity to engage with that particular puzzle. So first of all, like on a like basic theoretical level, like absolutely, I agree with Shannon and also with you, Brandon, that separating space and time and treating space simply as static and fixed and time as dynamic, it's not a very productive thing. And of course, that's a long argument within radical geography. There are different positions on it. David Harvey, among others, for many years has been insisting spatiotemporal dynamics. And in a certain way, like, the very concept that Lefebvre introduced, the production of space, like in that title, it already essentially contains the position. And the whole book is just an unpacking of it. So l'espace, space, is not a container, it's not a platform, it's not a fixed thing in a kind of Cartesian, Euclidean way, but rather l'espace, it's process, it's spatialization processes. And then the challenge is to introduce more specific, we might say meso-level concepts, perhaps urbanization is one such concept, through which to understand spatialization processes. So on a sort of almost ontological level, like that's a core commitment for me, but working out the methodological implications of that proposition is a complex thing because it's very easy. It's a problem in our conceptual grammar. I mean, Nietzsche famously pointed that out, way back, and not only Nietzsche, that our conceptual grammar constrains us to talk about things. So even if we're working with a processual relational understanding, the existence of nouns, I mean, we talk about the city, any other noun, the state, the economy, it kind of, in a certain way, operates against what might be our reflexive instincts about trying to analyze processes instead of things. So that's why it gets a little bit awkward in our language, but instead of saying the city, I try to say city building and maybe even unbuilding processes, or instead of the urban, although sometimes I do use that term for other reasons, urbanization. And then we really have to unpack what does the shun, what does urbanization mean? Another dimension of that question, which I just want to briefly speak to and which may get into questions about research design. So anytime, if you take that proposition seriously, and you're trying to research urbanization, what is the appropriate unit of analysis for your study? And this is something I discuss with, I have several doctoral students in the room. We talk about this all the time. And I talk about with my undergraduates as well, and with my colleagues, what is the appropriate research design? And obviously there are traditions of urban studies where the appropriate research design for an urban studies analysis would be basically one of two things. It could be a city or some set of zone or zones within a city, or it's a comparison among some combination of the latter entities. And okay, there's obviously a lot of powerful research that's been done based on that framework, but what happens if you prioritize a processual relational approach in developing your research design? How do you do that? So you have to start with the process. What process am I trying to understand? And how does that process then crystallize within particular places, territories, scales, landscapes? So it changes. You may still end up looking at it, what we call a neighborhood or even what we call a city, but the emphasis is on the process rather than on the site. And a further complication, which several of us in the room among my close collaborators who are here are thinking about, and we haven't figured it out, but hopefully we'll have a paper or two in some years ahead. How do you periodize urbanization? And it may seem like, oh, well, it's pretty obvious. And then, if we had more time, I'd love to hear what obvious ideas you might have about how to periodize it. But it's actually not obvious. So one approach would be you start with a thing like a city, and then you simply look at how it evolves over time. And because you've decided in advance that you have a fixed entity, namely the city that you're periodizing, the thing is under control because you've started with the assumption that there's a thing that is a discrete entity that has an evolution in time, but we reject that assumption. Another approach that would also be on some level convenient, although it has problems of its own, is to do essentially what a lot of very otherwise sophisticated urban theorists do, including David Harvey and many others, which is you embed your periodization of urbanization within a periodization of something else. So in other words, David Harvey's classic periodization of the capitalist city, he basically takes a kind of generic model of Euro-American capitalist history since the 16th or 17th century and just builds in different models of urban form into that. So you got your mercantile city, you got your industrial city, you've got your Fordist Keynesian, or he sometimes calls it corporate monopoly city, and then you've got your neoliberal or post-Fordist or post-Keynesian city. And you can do a lot of work with that. And David Harvey, I don't want to give him a hard time because he's obviously foundational to how many of us think about these issues. But ultimately, it doesn't solve our problem because it's not really a periodization of urbanization. It's a periodization of different morphologies of city building embedded within a broader meta-narrative about systemic cycles of accumulation, or as he puts it, regimes of accumulation. But urbanization isn't really periodized. So anyway, it goes exactly to Brandon's kind of question about how do we, like what do you do with a spatiotemporal account? If you really take that seriously, you have to actually ask, what is the spatiotemporality of urbanization? And part of what we're working on, and again, hopefully we'll get back to, we'll get some stuff written up about this, reflecting on the problem and then making some offerings. The actual morphology or geography of urbanization, it involves particular vectors, as we've been calling them. Will Conroy's in the room and Swarnab Ghosh, vectors of operationalization, in which sites of city building are articulated to broader zones. We could call them hinterlands, but they take particular forms within the imperial historical geographies of capitalism, in which other zones beyond the sites of city building are effectively operationalized as metabolic and reproductive supports of city building processes. So the plantations that I mentioned earlier in relation to 19th century Manchester are a zone of operationalization of urban development processes in the industrial city. You can't understand the industrial city except in relation to those zones of operationalization, which also, for those of you interested in kind of world ecology approaches, absolutely involve metabolic rifts and metabolic churns. There's massive thermodynamic ecological imperialism associated with the building and unbuilding of Manchester. You could fast forward it, make the same analysis of, Osmanization in 19th century Paris. Like there are all kinds of broader extended geographies being operationalized in order to support the Second Empire. The same thing for the metropolitan Chicago that the Chicago School were writing about. So it literally, the city is still there, but what we're trying to do both in our theoretical historical work and in our cartography is develop a way to articulate those particular patterns and pathways of city building to these broader vectors that are being operationalized. And that includes, this is a big topic. It includes obviously zones of waged work, but lots of unpaid reproductive work. And, as Jason Moore would say, free gifts of nature that get metabolized ultimately to support those city building processes. I'm just summarizing what, again, Will Conroy, Swarnab Ghosh, I don't know if Salma Abdul Hussein is in the room, but she's another collaborator on this. We've been working on this, and it's definitely, it's not just a general metaphor of implosion, explosion. We're actually trying to historicize it and map it. So Diego, I've just gone on for a long time in relation to Brandon's remark, and I haven't addressed your question about Storper and Scott. And I would like to, but I'm a little worried about giving a mini lecture here. So if I may, believe me, I've got the question written down, and I know you asked me that question once before and I didn't answer. I promise I'm going to answer, but I'm thinking, let me just ask Shannon as our convener, what should we do? Should we ask for a few other contributions and I'll try to swerve back to Diego at some point, or what would you advise? Sorry, Shannon, you're muted at the moment.
Sorry, but I muted myself. We have two more questions, which is probably just about perfect for timing. And you started to answer, I think, the first. I've been chatting here with Evan, but Evan, if you wouldn't mind speaking up your question. And then Hung Bo also wanted me to read a question. Do you want me to read it or let Evan go first?
And Hung, if you're here, you should give us your question yourself so I can say hi to you. Hung is I have so many former students in the room, current and former students. It makes me so happy that you're all here. So Hung, if you're willing, whether Evan goes first or you, I'd love to say hi. There he is. Great. Nice to see you. Okay. Fantastic. I hope you're well.
So Evan and then Hung. That sounds good.
Yeah. You sort of in your last response, we're starting to get yourself to what I was asking about anyway. So I guess I'm just going to kind of push you to go a little bit further in that direction still. And that has to do with these metabolic processes and the relationship between the city and the hinterland. You know, for a lot of us, like we don't, you know, Burgess and Park are not really relevant anymore, but William Cronon remains very, very relevant to understanding the way that the urban operates at scales well beyond, you know, the political city limits. So yeah, so I kind of just want to encourage you to elaborate more on what you were just talking about at the end of your last comment there.
Thank you so much, Evan. Fantastic question. And hopefully we'll dialogue about this stuff in more detail in other contexts, but thank you for putting that out there. It's fundamental. And should we go ahead and go to Hung at this point?
Well,
Greetings,
that was a brilliant discussion, and it's great hearing everyone. And now I have to turn my brain from 0 to 100 to engage in person. But I think my question and an interest is kind of how your thought has really shifted on what you considered in the 90s. And I've been reading your 1999 paper on state, place, and scale, where you were deliberate about the use of this geographical scale. And you've delineated, I think, different kinds of scale. And I'm just curious in your new work, how planetary urbanization has transposed, or how scale has been transposed to your new thoughts about planetary urbanization and the shifting perhaps of the circle around how we would approach thinking about scale in our various research and practices.
Great question. Thank you so much. Okay, should I give it a go, Shannon? Should I give it a try? Okay, cool. So awesome. So let me go in reverse order. I'll go with Hung's question about scale, and then Evan's question about Cronon, and then I'll come back to Diego's question about the debates on the nature of cities, as Scott and Stuart would call them. So in terms of Hung's question about scale, so let me clarify the auto-critique. In the presentation, I explained I've got this auto-critique where I supersede, I kind of, it's like an Aufhebung of my own approach. So here's the auto-critique. So the earlier work on scaling and rescaling of the urban, I would argue, looking back on my work from the last 2 decades, that basically I was opening up a framework beyond city-centric approaches to the urban, but in a certain way, it was a multi-scalar approach to the problem of agglomeration. In the sense that the problem of the urban for me was essentially circumscribed by large metropolitan regions. And what I was arguing, and what I argued in a lot of the substantive research chapters of the book, where I'm in dialogue with Saskia Sassen and my friend Harvey Malich and others on different approaches to urban theory, is that we need to embed the global city, or the city as a growth machine, or the new economy, or the new regionalism within a multi-scalar architecture of governance and also of accumulation strategies. But the problematique at core that I was presupposing, even though I was opening up the urban to this broader interscalar geography, ultimately the essential expression of the urban for me was the metropolitan region. So those are my LA school roots. I mean, I kind of come out of a certain hybrid of Marxian economic geography via David Harvey and others, in the LA school's particular account of post-1970s and 1980s forms of agglomeration. So in the planetary urbanization work, again, it's not that I'm abandoning the idea that agglomeration or city building and unbuilding. Unbuilding, by the way, is a term I get from Lewis Mumford. He talks about Abbau, the unbuilding, the destruction, the building and the destruction and the rebuilding of the city, which is pretty actually important to this theory. I'll talk about that another day maybe. But anyway, planetary urbanization still presupposes that the building and unbuilding and rebuilding of cities, agglomerations, metropolitan regions are important. But the problematique of the urban itself, for me, is no longer, this is a radical break from my earlier work, but also really, I'm in a lot of trouble, I think, as Diego knows, with my colleagues in the field of urban studies, many of whom think this is really problematic. But it's a radical break from a century plus of urban studies that has really lodged conceptually the urban with the moment of agglomeration. And the argument that me and my close collaborator, Christian Schmidt of ETH Zurich, and now other close collaborators, including several in the room, are arguing is that the urban is, and the urbanization process is a relational dialectic that has both moments, the moment of implosion, which is basically the moment of concentration, what Christian and I called concentrated urbanization, and the moment of explosion, the building and rebuilding and unbuilding of non-city spaces to support city building and as a result of city building. And a lot can be encompassed under that, but it's basically an invitation to explore the dynamic reorganization of non-city spaces through their contribution metabolically, politically, economically, through labor and so much else to city building, but also the ways in which city building processes in turn externalize, like carbon and waste and so much else. I gave a lecture about it to my undergrads, some of whom are also in the room, to non-city spaces. So the non-city, the kind of, I'm glad this is now coming up so that I can crystallize the argument maybe more sharply. For us, the non-city is constitutive of city building. It's not just a hinterland. That's why the term hinterland, I use it as a way to point to the problem, but it doesn't really get at the problematique adequately. The non-city, the urbanization process for us is a dialectic in which the city, non-city mutually co-evolve through all kinds of contradictory dynamics, which we're trying to analyze historically in relation to modern capitalism. So instead of thinking of the non-city as the exterior, which then interacts with or is affected by the city, it's constitutive to the urban problematique. We understand that as a kind of Lefebvrean conception of the urban, or at least it's inspired by it, but it's also a radical break in a way from my own earlier work where, it's a multi-scalar approach to city building. But this is now, so in terms of your question, where is scale in this? It's a multi-scalar approach to concentrated and extended urbanization. In other words, just as we analyze city building in a multi-scalar way, we also need to understand the remaking of agrarian landscapes, the remaking of extractive landscapes, the remaking of logistics systems, the externalization of ecological consequences of city building in multi-scalar terms. So the reflexively scalar analytic is incredibly useful, but it's no longer simply oriented towards the analysis of city building. So I don't know if everybody's still with me. It's getting a little technical and I apologize, but for those of you who are kind of embedded in some of these debates, that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so Evan, thank you for your question about Cronin. So Cronin is clearly an intellectual, a kindred spirit in many ways, in the sense that, as you rightly point out, he insists that we cannot understand Chicago except in terms of the Great West, and that we, arguably we can't understand the Great West except in terms of Chicago. They mutually co-evolve. I mean, we can talk about, it's actually more about Chicago in a certain way. It's the flow of all this other stuff into the Great West. You can reverse it. And that's actually, I see you nodding, and yeah, I may have intuited your reaction, but anyway, so we'd have to have a longer conversation about that. But there are a couple things to say about Cronin, which I'll try to be concise just in consideration of time. So one thing is his conceptualization of Chicago as an urban space and of what he also calls the hinterland building on von Thunen. It's a metabolic relationship, but but what he kind of does is he takes a sort of snapshot in a certain moment of capitalist development, like obviously late 19th century. And within that snapshot, he looks at this relational co-evolutionary dynamic. And so it's very generative and very methodologically productive. But I think what our approach would do is say, we've got to embed that particular snapshot. So he upscales out to the broader region. You've got Chicago and its proximate regional hinterland. We would take it further, albeit building upon and inspired by his insights in several different respects. Number one, we wouldn't stop with the Great West. In other words, the so-called hinterland of Chicago doesn't end with the Great West. You've got to follow what today we might call the supply chains all the way out through the world economy. And another brilliant, actually, book that's going in the same direction and very inspiring, but has some of the same, not so much limitations, but just parameters. In other words, you set up a project and you have parameters. So I don't really mean it as a critique, but some of you might know Gray Brecken's book on Imperial San Francisco, which looks at the coevolution of San Francisco and the broader kind of extractive geographies of California. And it's very much in that Cronin-esque spirit. But in the same way, we would take it further in the sense that these metabolic relationships that underpin and in turn are transformed by Chicago or San Francisco, they don't stop with that proximate hinterland. The other way in which I think, when I say we, I mean me and my collaborators, including several in this room, Will and Swarnab, would take it further, is that we're very interested in the question of what happens in what we call the long, and not only us, building on, of course, Arrighi, what happens in the long 20th century in terms of those relationships? And it's a big question. It's central to the work of Urban Theory Lab Chicago in the future. But basically, just to give you a few hints, Cronin's hinterland isn't particularly industrialized. They're kind of emergent forms of capitalization. To use Jason Moore's distinction between appropriation and capitalization. So there's a lot of appropriation of what Jason Moore building on Marx calls free gifts of nature, timber and so on. But most of the industrialization occurs within the city. The hinterland is kind of a standing reserve. It's slightly organized. It's kind of, we might say, again, to use another distinction, Marxist distinction, it's formally subsumed. In other words, it's kind of operationalized in order to sort of channel materials to support industrialization in Chicago, but the hinterland's not particularly industrialized. If you compare, just to stay with Cronin's territory, the US Corn Belt today, which Nikos Katsikas, I don't think he's here, but another close collaborator from the Urban Theory Lab has been writing about, just massive land use rationalization, massive ecological simplification with devastating consequences that stretch all through the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, massive rationalization of labor, replacement of living labor by dead labor machines, so automation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not a paradigm. There are many other forms of reconstitution of non-city spaces, and that's kind of in a certain way an extreme example. But the drive to mechanize the hinterland, the rolling out of infrastructures, the way that reconfigures labor, going back to the theme of dispossession and displacement from before, the way it reconfigures ecological relationships in deeply contradictory and destructive ways, that has to be part of the story of urbanization in the long 20th century. And so Cronin gets us started in many ways just by opening up the frame, the city and the non-city, the city and the hinterland. But we, in a certain way, we need to dynamize and reconceptualize and historicize that so-called hinterland. So the concept of operational landscape that we've been developing, it's sort of simply an invitation to develop that problematique. Again, we don't really have an adequate vocabulary. And again, it's something that we're wrestling with in our group. So, okay.
I'm getting a note from our technical person that we're going to lose him, which means we lose the capacity. He's the only sole host. So with regret, I think we have to, I'm not going to regret saying thank you, but let's all give Neil applause of gratitude for being here in multiple dimensions and sharing his work with us. I think we didn't get to the pandemic city. So if you're up for it, I would love to book a future event just to talk about that, because I think there would be a lot of interest, even as a work in progress. And maybe we can also, I'd love to think with the people about this question of pandemic time too, which is very much on my mind. I'm thinking about doing an article on it. And I love that Evan's question got us back to my question on time and my ask about contextualizing this concretely for Chicago. And as you know from my communication to you, Neil, Cronin was also very much on my mind. So you brought it home. You took it to the bridge and then you took it home. That's what jazz musicians also say when you repeat the A refrain. You want a last word, Neil?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say, so first of all, Evan, I believe, is teaching a course or has been on pandemic city, pandemic urbanism. And so
great.
we should also hear from Evan on that. That would be brilliant. And I would love to be part of that conversation. I wanted to say, Diego, it happened again. I got out of answering your question, but let's correspond because obviously I have some thoughts on the matter. I mean, basically, I disagree with Alan Scott and Michael Storper because it's a universal theory. I think we need more historical contextual theories. I also disagree with the tendency in at least certain streams of post-colonial urban studies to develop entirely contextualist, particularist approaches. I think we need something else, which is part of what I'm trying to develop. But so I won't say anything more than that. And just by way of conclusion, let me thank everyone. A lot of people stayed for the whole thing. And I really appreciate your time and your attention to this. Thanks to all for being here. Thank you to 3CT for sponsoring this event. It's an honor to be connected to 3CT in this conversation. You know, it's a kind of unit on campus that I have, you know, a lot of kind of, just appreciation of, given the role it's played in my own intellectual development, you know, with Bill, with Moish, with the Komaroffs from an earlier time. So I'm delighted to see 3CT continue to flourish in this particular moment. And last but not least, let me thank, you know, Anna Jones for your support of organizing the event. And also, I believe our tech support is Joe. I don't know if you're still there waiting for us.
He needs to go to Beijing urgently. Okay,
sorry, Joe, I'm making you late, but thank you. And last but not least, Shannon, thank you so much for your intellectual generosity and comradeship. I really appreciate the dialogue, and I look forward to continuing in, you know, the time ahead, hopefully face-to-face in due course.
Yeah, we'll have you back with canapes, okay, and wine, right. Good night, everyone. Thanks everyone.
Be well.